In this collection of videos, we are going to introduce data types, variables, and the floating point data type using the language of Python as an example. Now, when we write computer programs, our computer programs need to store all different types of things internally. One example we've seen before is that our computer might need to store strings, which are collections of characters that you could type on the keyboard. Other things that our computers might need to store are numbers. There are different types of numbers. There are whole numbers. There are numbers with decimal points. There's something called a Boolean data type, which is a true or a false value that we'll study in later videos. And then there are even more data types in the world because there's all sorts of user-defined data types, and Python is particularly rich with external libraries that will import other data types for us. More specifically, a data type is some category of object, and along with that is the set of permissible values for storing within that object and operations that can be performed on those values. One example, if you're thinking about the string data type, which we've already seen, the set of permissible values would be all things we can enter from the keyboard or all things that are in that ASCII character code we discussed. And one possible operation that you could perform on different strings would be to combine them by concatenating them. If hello were one string and world was another string, you may want to, in essence, add those strings together to make them say hello world. So that's a brief example of what a data type is, and we'll dive deeper into studying the floating point data type in this collection of slides. Before we get to that point, however, there are some things we need to understand about different programming languages and the way that they operate. For example, programming languages can be either dynamic or static, and the Python programming language is called a dynamically typed programming language. And I've put a visual here of wood and water because to me that helps me visualize the difference between the two things. Whenever we have a particular piece of data in a static programming language, it is the programmer's job to tell the computer what type of object it is. For example, if I want to input a lot of characters from the keyboard, it would be my job as the programmer to tell the computer that I am giving it a string. In a dynamic programming language, it is not the programmer's job to determine the type of an object. You just hand it over to the computer, and it's the computer's job to determine the type of that instance. This also means that within Python, if we have a variable, which we'll discuss more a little bit later, and we initially have that variable holding a particular type of data, like a string, and then later on we want to change that variable to hold on to a different data type, now maybe we want it to hold a number instead of a word, then Python's not going to give us any fuss about this at all. In a static programming language, the computer would not allow something like that, and it would give you an error. So this is one of the nice things about Python, is that it's not our job as the programmer to even know the type of the object that we're dealing with. And if something needs to be changed and we need to change from one type of data to another type of data, the computer's going to do that without any trouble. However, because we are not the ones telling the computer the type of the object that we're using, the computer is figuring out the type of the object in the background, there can be times where the programmer doesn't know the type of an object, and that can be problematic. There's a workaround for this in Python, which is that if you ask Python what is the type of this object, it will tell you whenever you use the type function, and we'll give an example of using that type function in Python later on in the videos. One of the reasons we may ultimately care what the type of an object is that Python is what's called a strongly typed programming language, and there are strong versus weak programming languages. And what this means is that Python has different data types working in the background, some of them more similar than others. Python will have no problem combining objects that are numbers. Think about this as like we can take two different instances of numbers and combine them together in Python very easily. We could take two different words in Python and we could combine them together very easily. But in a strongly typed language, when you have two very different types of things, Python will have a problem with combining them. Because these two objects are very different, Python is not going to know how to combine them, and it will give you an error when you try to do such a thing. In a weakly typed programming language, your computer is always going to work to find some sort of common ground between the two data types in order to combine them in some way, even if that might not be what you want.